Welcome back to the Frase podcast. You are here again, beautiful Gold Coast, and one of my special hangouts, Frase. Ooh, the observer effect. It's something that's been popping up in my YouTube feed lately a lot. It does build on the previous podcast episode and all the content really around embodiment, and at the same time releasing attachment to the identity or the perception of self that we're embodied, to be in that somewhat of a detached, magnetic, allowing reality change in a fluid, easeful, abundant way frequency. So there has to be a bit of the bridge with this. Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult one to even conceptualize, to talk about. And part of me, normally when I'm beginning a podcast and wanting to bring something forward, I normally let it kind of work through my subconscious for a week or so before it comes through. But a similar perspective of the embodiment and how we're going to tie this into a embodied perception of self. For me, an embodiment as a performer, a producer, a creator of content that adds value. At the same time, not being attached to that, seeing it as someone, a performer without an attached form. You've got to be willing to just show up and perform. There's a saying that we are what we do, and what we do is a reflection of how we see ourselves and what we be. But the difficulty of being too much in a fixed identity, personality, a role that we take so seriously or too seriously, is we can't move outside it. We can't see the forest and the trees because we're so deep in the forest of the mind. And that's where there's this balance will probably be the theme of this podcast. The balance of the observer effect is when we're moving towards goals. And a bit of an esoteric perspective from this one, even to identify that we, let's call it the ego identity, us, that we're moving towards a goal that we believe is going to add value or provide some type of reward for us. Because that's all our actions in reality are driven by this perception of reward, or perhaps a fear of losing what we've won if we don't do it. Whether that's money, jobs, relationship, when we have a motivation, we feel we've got to get the candy from that action, don't we? So it's understandable to have this goal-driven desires. But when we go through this spiritual awakening, and I think if you're here today, you're quite likely had it, there's this sense that all those things that we're moving so strongly towards, the importance of them somewhat collapse, because there's been somewhat of from a scientific perspective, we'd say it's been a quantum shift or a near-death experience. There's been a sudden loss of identity or release because they're related, a release of importance of that personality. And that's why it's things that kind of happen in our reality that can once feel or still feel important, but then at this sudden loss, create this separation from importance, like losing a loved one, a relationship breakdown, a near death, where life felt so important to this personality. When that happens, there's this greater separation, and it doesn't feel as important as it used to be. And so that's what I'm saying. When these goals that we think we want, there's this greater realization that who is it that wants the goals? Are we wanting the goals? Or are we being moved towards a goal that we think is going to provide a relief when there's already this sense of fullness, wholeness, completion? So that's where this observer effect comes in. And it comes from the embodiment journey, which seemingly can't exist. Because to be embodied in the identity of Frase, who's an author, a podcaster, a producer of content that adds value, if that's to be seen so much like we say here in Australia, like bricks and mortar, fixed home, dwelling, that's who I am, put my name above the door type arrangement, it can be helpful to be embodied in that, because when we go out into the world, this is who I am. I'm Frase. I'm the producer. We're getting to the next part. I'm the book author. I do these things. But to be too fixed in that is to repeating the same attachment to personality that got me stuck in the performance of Michael Fraser, who is a good boy, good student, good chartered accountant, who shows up and pleases and he tries to validate his identity to the people around. It's somewhat of the same trap. And it's not necessarily a trap when it's adding value, because both of them add value. The person that was very pleasing, the Michael Fraser before my Camino experience, that was showing up in the world and had good relationships, a family, etc. That was adding value to a lot of the people around me, but it was ultimately also draining my energy field because I felt consistently ungrounded. I was unembodied because my embodiment was really it was driven from an identity to please. So this is the subtlety with this, is the success of it being embodied. Embodiment is not really even in the personality. There's this stage of the spiritual awakening that I talk about a lot, and I really feel it's come out pardon me, even as I've been showing up in the world and stepping into my power and using more of my voice. It's a strange thing that when we have the initial awakening experience, I call it the initiation phase. And yeah, we're learning to craft a new reality for ourselves. And as that identity has shifted and it can't go back to what it used to, we've dove down the rabbit hole, we've taken the neo red pill, we've stepped out of the fixed attachment to that old, for me, the Michael Fraser identity that doesn't fit the norm, and it was facilitated a lot by grief, loss of loved ones, relationship breakdown, but ultimately walking a Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage in 80 days in a new, kind of an unidentified self, what I talked about in last week's podcast, become identityless. Michael Fraser died on that identity. The Michael Fraser identity died on that Camino experience, and that was my initiation. At the same time, it was beginning of the integration phase, and when it started, it's moving towards integrating to a new identity, which will eventually become embodied. But what we find, the bricks and mortar metaphor, is that as we go through the integration, the embodiment for me, becomes aligned with my third book, connected that three phases. We act for the spirit. We act for our higher self. We act for our heart passions. We release attachment for either the idea of the external goal that used to please people because it was coming from a lack or a sense of unworthiness in oneself. We decide to just act or perform from the greater design or inspiration that comes through us. And that is the embodiment, but the embodiment is not a tangible thing. You see what I mean? Yeah, it's a difficult one to understand. It's like, so the bricks and mortar of the home metaphor is it's in the ground, because that's the house and we live in the house. And it's a similar thing again. So I'm not saying embodiment is not a physical thing at the same time, but the physical, it's a hard one to say, but I'll keep persisting and hopefully this resonates. The physical body does change, it evolves and it grows and it becomes an embodied acting for the spirit perspective, because it's no longer the old version that used to see its external worth in the other. But at the same time, even though it's embodied in this version of adding value, it's not attached, and that's a similar thing with the house. Every house or dwelling, everything comes and goes and will be demolished eventually. But the embodiment of who we are when we're no longer attached to a personality, the embodiment is ultimately embodiment of the spirit, or what you could say, the higher case, capital S self, compared to the lowercase self. So this is the awakening journey in the initiation, integration, embodiment. Is the initiation is becoming aware of how much our way we think about our reality, and ultimately the people we might have given importance to, impacts our experience of it. And how, because we think about it and it's attached to an identity, ultimately it's the collapse or somewhat of at least a great disruption in that fixed so permanent name across the housetop, Michael Fraser identity that collapses, that creates this spaciousness in our ability to create more inspired changes. That moves us to this space of integration where we're kind of between the two worlds, or we can't go back to the old identity that used to feel so important, and yet we don't yet have enough awareness or spaciousness, or somewhat, I would argue it's also detachment. We need to detach more, even more so from that old identity, to be more aligned with allowing our heart to create this greater sense of intuitive awareness and how we may best serve the divine, serve the spirit through being a conduit for the spirit by embodiment of our worthiness. And ultimately that worthiness, that just being worthy in who we are, speaking our truth, whether it's through a sharing of the product or a service, ultimately there's this realization of whatever we do and however we share within the world, it's not really about how we share it. The embodiment becomes this realization, or we call it a return or a reconciliation with the higher case self that was always worthy. So the journey of this observer effect that I'm bringing a little bit full circle in this episode, that it's a little bit difficult for me to even speak about, but if you come here today, I feel there's probably some energetic resonance. Is we go through this integration of what we call the shadow healing journey after the initiation experience, and then it becomes this consistently showing up as that, what I called in last week's podcast. It's it's like identityless self. But there is still an identity. There's an embodiment of who we are. But by identity, I would say it's the lowercase self, the personality that we felt so attached to. The importance around it has died. And what we're moving now, we're moving into performer mode, observer effect mode. And that's where performance and looking at life as someone to play, a dance, a movement, a detached spaciousness. And I'm not saying flying on a cloud above all the drama, because that can also take us away from the richness of life. But this is same yin yang. It's this the two poles. It's being deeply embodied in the world, but seeing that we're not on the world. That's the saying, being in the world but not on the world, and that's the dance. But it can't make rational sense from the old conditioning. It said you are this person, you come from this background, and this is your ancestral story, and this is your name, and these are your parents, your siblings, your loved ones, and this is your personal history. And so this is how you're defined, and you will keep. It just doesn't have that heaviness anymore, that resonance anymore. It doesn't exist like that. And it can't exist like that. And that's why there's that integration, the shadow healing phase, and purifying that old personality, which was, it functioned to a degree. It led to that awakening experience that created therefore the difficulties with it, that create that separation from it. And then there's this sense of, I'm still back I've come full circle and back in the world, and I'm embodied in who I am, because all my power has been brought back into my own energy field. So there's an embodiment of the spirit, or higher case self, and we can give ourselves a name for that. And people like Eckhart Tolle take on a new name. Eckhart Tolle is not his original name. I think Louise L. Hay in the Hay House community, I don't think that's her name either. A lot of people will take on that name, but as I've been talking about a lot here, Bruce Wayne and Batman. Batman is his expression to deal with the shadow healing, but he's neither Bruce Wayne or Batman. He's self. He's I am, beyond the self. But what there's this greater realization is when he comes into whether he's using the name of Bruce Wayne or Batman in the costume, there's just not that importance of what there used to be. And so there's freedom within that. And what I'm getting at around all this, and I think and feel if you've drawn to this today, it's this funny thing. Embodiment for me is ultimately becoming detached from the personality that we used to think so important. So there's this embodiment of selflessness, which ultimately is a higher case self. So it doesn't seem to make sense, does it? We're almost embodied in the ether. We're embodied in our detachment from the drama. We're embodied and our return of energy in our own self. We're embodied from our separation from the old identity and the old drama patterns. So the embodiment is ultimately about how we choose to show up in the world as a performance of that self, higher self that is formless. So everything is something of a performance when we realize that we've gone through this, the real lies that the reality has been risen to our sight. We have real, trying to get it out, it's coming. The reality that we used to see as we realize has become the sense that what we do see is ultimately about how we perceive ourselves within that I am self that is within us. So the formlessness needs a form to express itself through, as these words come out through me. This person, Mike Frase, or who's the author perspective, the performer. But, the Christbodylove perspective for me is the magician, the alchemist frequency. And that has a different performance because it exists on a different platform. But they're both little aspects. One's the magician and Mike Fraser is the author of the king frequency. They're just performances, and like actors take on different roles within reality. Like athletes often have their own, we talk about successful athletes, I'm wearing my Michael Jordan at the moment. Michael Jordan is a different person when he's on the basketball court than when he's off the basketball court. They're functions of the divine that we allow to move through us. So to be embodied and identityless, at the same time, it's ultimately to recognize that the source of the divine, our higher self, is always empowering us in this performance and play of reality. But so rather than being so stuck in fixed, firm, external identities that we're trying to hold up to the world, the full embodiment is ultimately this realization we are more than the name and the form and the human that exists within the world. We're a human being in the world, and it's ultimately aligning more with the being as the performance of the human. Thanks again for being a part of this. Pray and intend it was of value for you. Bye for now.